Well, good morning, everybody. Let's kick things off. My name is Bill Whitelaw. I'm the Managing Director of Strategy and Sustainability at Geologic Systems and JWN Energy. And it's my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today's discussion about data and decision-making in our industry. And we can tell by the number of registrations and the interest shown in this webinar, the topic of data and the way data informs decision-making in the sector today is of great interest to a very diverse spectrum of stakeholders in our sector. So today we're really going to focus between some of the research that I'll talk about and our great panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. We're really going to talk about how data for E&P companies and oilfield services companies, we're finding always discovering and unveiling new ways of driving productivity, winning new business, and improving project planning in terms of, we'll unpack some of those things. And so our agenda really is to show you a bit of the highlights of a recent piece of research that we did in partnership with the Daily Oil Bulletin within our portfolio of companies. We'll go into a great panel discussion, but as always, the quality of the panel is enhanced by the quality of the questions from the audience. So in terms of, by now you're all familiar with the realities of Zoom and the tools within Zoom, and questions can be supplied using the Q&A function on the navigation bar, and we'll hopefully, panel won't need any of my questions because there'll be such great questions from the audience and we'll keep track of those and you can start populating the questions even during my context setting around some of the research, and then we'll get back to those questions during the panel discussion. The slides that I'll show you in a few minutes will be emailed to you right after so you don't have to worry about tracking down any of the numbers or writing them down. You'll get the slides, but you'll also get a link. The slides are really sort of teased out of a larger piece of research that we did in a white paper that we just recently produced. And you'll also get the link to be able to download that. So today we've got a great panel, and these are faces that are familiar to all of you. We have David Hood, who's the CEO of Geologic Systems and JWN Energy. Andy Ma, longtime oil and gas leader, CEO of Advantage Energy. And Kevin Krausert, who comes to us with two hats on, previously president of Beaver Drilling and a longtime pillar of our drilling contractor community, but now the CEO and founder of Avatar Innovations. And we're going to unpack some of the great things that Avatar is doing in the data world as well. So, we've always been a data-driven industry, and we would not honor our past if we all of a sudden said, hey, we're finally getting around to using data. We've been evolving how we think about data and how we use data in our sector for years and decades, and everybody on this webinar knows that. But we're at an interesting inflection point in our industry's evolution. Andy graciously joins us today. He's also a participant in CIBC's annual conference, and they're talking about the evolving energy landscape and what Canada needs to do to continue to be a competitive player in a global environment. And I'll invite Andy to speak to some of those issues. So these inflection points, and whether you put a net zero label around them or whether you put an ESG label around them, we're using data in much more sophisticated ways, informing better decisions all the time. And the technologies that we're using to be able to inform those decisions, and it's a bad geological metaphor, but I'll say it anyways. A lot of our respondents to the survey, when we unpacked it, said, we had great porosity in the data we held within our companies. We just had poor permeability, and now technology is enabling us to sort of bring diverse data sets into play and start to understand better the relationships between all the data we gather as a sector and the way we use that data to drive performance. So again, just some background on the research. We were very pleased with the statistical validity of it. We had 330 representatives from a diverse spectrum of operating companies and oilfield services companies, and we were able to break it down into meaningful buckets that sort of spoke to company size, where they're operating and how they're servicing. And the survey goals were, again, to sort of really take a slice in time look at how data is being informed, to inform different decision makings, how it's being incorporated into new workflows. And we really wanted to know how companies were integrating data into new platforms and being able to visualize it and use the analytical tools that cloud technology, for example, permits you to do. And what we found was some exciting things around companies and the sophistication of the way they're using it. And we also wanted to point to a future in which data will become even more important in how companies will operate and perform, and how they define their integrity with diverse stakeholders like regulators and policymakers and even the public. And not to say nothing about investors, and that we bundled all that research together in the white paper that I spoke of earlier, and you'll be able to download that if you haven't already. And it's a great tool to put before your management teams, your colleagues, and discuss where you fit on that spectrum of results. So again, for the next few minutes, I'll just give you some quick highlights. Again, you're going to get these slides, so don't worry about making a lot of notes. But some of the data that we were able to tease out was really interesting. So 45% of the respondents spoke to operational efficiency as being the driver, the key driver of it. And we know that we're moving, as prices go up, commodity prices rise, we're moving into an era, though, of where operational efficiency will be of paramount importance. And we were able to figure out and tease out of the data how companies are using that to be ever better at what they do. And business development became a close second, in terms of, especially for oilfield services companies, data is helping them find new business. Data is driving the way they get in front of their clients and how they actually enhance their performance for those clients with the data. And then competitive analysis, as you might expect, is also an important consideration in terms of data usage. And then 25% of respondents talked about how data is informing better project planning and also driving next generation research and development in terms of understanding how to think about, again, operational efficiency, but next generation technologies that fit within their ESG goals, as an example. So what we also found through the research is that, as you might imagine, there's different user communities for data within different company setups, and lighter users, depending on the department or the function you're in, only need access to one or two data sets. But what was really interesting is the heavy users who need to see in one sort of universe a whole variety of data sets, and being able to sort of integrate those data tools in a way that informs better decision making. And to the last point here, the 20% of the heavy users, they're starting to find new ways of integrating subsurface and geological and engineering information with surface-related data, in terms of financial performance. So that was a very interesting finding in terms of something we've always done, but technology is enabling us to do it in a different way now, and get to a decision much more rapidly than perhaps in the past. And this was also interesting to us, again, confirming some of our suspicions of what we see in geologic and JWN, but 70% of E&P companies incorporate third-party data into their workflows. And so there's this fascinating relationship between what external data tells you when it's married with your own data, and again, driving decisions. And our oilfield services clients, they are always finding new ways of using data in order to drive business decisions in terms of what kind of business do they want to chase and who do they want to chase it. And that was a number that we've seen rise over the years because of the way we can access data that informs better decisions now. But notwithstanding all of that, we did see a number of respondents identify challenges of, all of a sudden you have technology that allows these different data sets to come into relationship with each other, but they still may be strangers within that platform. And so companies are still trying to figure out the way how to synthesize and synchronize the data in different ways. And less than 1 in 10, so said that data and tools that they need, so there is room for improvement. Being able to integrate data more effectively and make it more readily accessible. We see this as a trend of democratizing data across a company's operations in terms of giving different user communities simultaneous access to the same kind of data sets. And so E&P companies, for those of you on the call or on the webinar who are in that community, they use all types of data in their decision-making processes. And you can see with some of the points here in terms of fracturing simulations and completions and drilling and production monitoring, forecasting. These are important tools, and they're driving that operational efficiency that I spoke of earlier. And they're also helping enable more effective project planning, right? In terms of things that are driving a big project through its various phases, keeping on time and on budget. And a lot of companies are still using data to look at the competitive landscape, and we see a big thread in there of how they're identifying potential acquisition targets. Heather, to oilfield services needs. And again, if you're in the OFS space, you're no stranger to this. But what we found was that companies are becoming a lot more sophisticated in the data that they gather and the relationships that they establish between that data to drive their business development needs. And if you're closer to the wellbore as a service company, you have a different set of data requirements than you do if you're in the products and services space over the life cycle of an asset. But what we found was that the oilfield services companies are becoming really, really good at understanding how to synthesize data to get them to a better business development decision very rapidly. And again, a lot of the detail and the numbers behind the graphs and charts are available in the white paper. Okay, Heather. And so all of that is context setting for our wonderful panel. Again, Andy and Kevin and David, what they're going to reflect on over the next 45 minutes is your questions and the questions that I'll ask them as we go through the process. I will remind everybody that this is being recorded, and so again, you'll be able to disseminate it to your colleagues at work or other friends within your networks to be able to capture the essence of the conversation. So I'll kick things off by asking Andy a question. He graciously joined us. He had just finished being on a panel opening up the CIBC conference. And Andy, could you reflect as a CEO of an operating company of what you spoke about in terms of the evolving energy landscape and your sense of how data will drive a lot of the decisions that will affect how we evolve and how efficiently we'll evolve?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Bill. And I also want to, thank all those that organized this event for the invitation to speak here today. So, and thanks to all that joined in. So just reflecting a little bit on, the conference that I spoke with or at this morning, as Bill alluded to, it was evolving landscapes in our sector. And it touched on, aspects right from, call it ESG, through to the operating companies, through to the business strategies for the E&P companies, as well as for Western Canada. And I think the data sets that, come to mind that are really critical are obviously, as Bill talked to already, digging into, let's say, the ability to identify opportunities to be more efficient with our operations. Let's get down to the core of, what we do, drilling and producing natural gas and oil wells. And that there's been a lot done in that aspect. But let's, I think we should also not forget that data today helps us also think through, the ESG aspect and emissions, particularly on everybody's tongue, is that, how can we better ourselves in the emissions side, which Canada is already a world leader, especially some of the natural gas producers, but how can we do it better? And unless we have good, reliable data and integrity there, you got to have something to be able to compare against that you believe is credible. And that it then extends into a lot of the political and public discussions on investment, as well as taking our products and looking for markets outside. So those were some of the key themes that came up, but it certainly all comes back to, the credibility, the strength, and the ability to process that data.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And sort of to riff off what you've just said so well, and we'll come back, Andy, and I'll invite you in a subsequent question, sort of unpack what data means for Canada's competitiveness in a global context, right, in terms of the opportunities there. But Kevin, over to you now. And I'll invite you to sort of reflect in two ways as a president in your past at Beaver Drilling, but also in the exciting things you're doing in Avatar Innovations now. And so starting with Avatar and, for example, your learning cohort, maybe you could describe for the audience what you saw in the last learning set of modules in terms of, there's 4 older white males on this panel, and we're in the process of handing off our industry's reins to a next generation set of leaders, and you have a bird's eye view into them and what their data dynamics are.
Well, yeah, first of all, Bill, thanks for having me on this panel, and thanks everyone for joining. In Avatar, we have the privilege of working with, hundreds of young professionals and young engineers from across the industry. And I'd say that, having worked in the energy sector for decades now, that there is, I'd say, a fundamental shift in terms of the capabilities and the thinking of it. And first of all, I don't pretend to understand them. What we try and do is create a culture of digital enablement. I joke sometimes that, these young engineers will remind me on a daily basis of how terrible I am at IT. What I try and do, and what I think industry should try and do for those of us who aren't as perhaps technically savvy, is really creating a culture around digital enablement, asking the right questions. Around making sure and then what they can do when they're off to the races is nothing short of remarkable. I'd say that, if I want to kind of put the framing of data over, I'd say the history of oil and gas, I'd really say we're stepping into what I would consider a 4th phase. There was the first kind of analog phase of data, where you would go down to the log library and you would find logs and you would correlate data. And then digital came about, and we sort of threw a sensor on everything, but we really didn't do anything with a lot of those sensors, and it was really driving a lot of decision making. And then that sort of fell us into what I would consider the 3rd phase, which was really a data quality phase of, how good is the data going in? How is this being tracked? It was still in a bunch of disparate spreadsheets in all of these different places. And now I'd say through those different phases, it led to incredible efficiency gains, adoptions of some new technologies. But now let's say that digital enablement is the kind of question is, how do we make sure that all the different data structures that are relevant to a decision-making process, an investment decision, are actually connected, and looking at it like a good engineer of mapping out your process, your decision, where are the challenges and the pinpoints, and how do you connect those systems to allow these special tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence to start really doing some of the interesting stuff that's coming on emerging technology. And so it's here, and I think creating a culture of digital enablement is where the industry is at, and I think it's going to be exciting to see what happens next.
Well, thank you very much for that, Kevin. And we do have our first question from an audience member. Rod Garland asked this really critical question, and it's a contradiction in our industry, but it's one. Rod asks, how can we resolve companies considering their data as competitive advantage with the need for a collaborative approach to data within the industry more generally? And I'm going to pass this off to David for the first answer, because of course at Geologic Systems, we've been big promoters of PPDM over the years, and the great work that PPM does, and now a fascinating global initiative that we're involved in called OSDU. And so these both drive to, how do we use data for competitive goods and also for the common good. So David, maybe if I can get you to reflect on how PPDM democratizes data, and also reflect and bring the audience up to speed on OSDU, because that's a fascinating initiative on the open source side of things.
Sure, Bill, I'd be happy to. And thank you for organizing this. We appreciate the people on the panel who've taken their time to be with us today when they're so busy with other things, and so many people for joining us. So there's been a lot of initiatives around this balancing public and proprietary data. You mentioned PPDM, and I think PPDM is one of the best known secrets in Calgary, although people know it all over the world. It's done a lot to standardize data and standardize data management right across the board. And OSDU, the Open System Data Universe, which has been a very important initiative in the data world, has been kicked off, driven by people like Shell and Chevron down in the States, is trying to move data more into the cloud and allow better access to multiple data sets through different applications. And interestingly, SSIO, who we acquired back in the fall of 2019, or 2020, excuse me, was the first software company that was invited to join OSDU, and there's tremendous access there. But I think and I'd be interested to hear Andy's view on this too, as to how this works. But I think one of the things, and I just want to touch on the component of getting our data more available, because in Alberta, we talk about our advantages with ESG, and we talk about how good we are with all of these things, and all of these things are true. But sometimes the broad data set does not always support it. And so in the sense that our data is the best on the planet, but when you go outside the sort of downhole data and you go into some of the other sort of environmental monitoring and ESG related data sets, they haven't been subjected to the same rigor, and we need to make sure that they are, so that we can tell the story of how well Alberta and the Western Canadian oil patch does in the industry. I'd be interested to hear how Andy, as an operator, balances this competitive advantage with the need for open data.
And so we'll just riff right over to you, Andy, on that. And I would ask you to sort of parallel it with the reality of, back to the theme of data and decision making, is most of this operating and services community are working with much substantially smaller staff than they had, say, in 2014. So there's been this contraction, and but to Kevin's point, we're being able to use new technologies and get along quite well with that reduced number of staff at the same time. So to riff off David's question first, and then sort of talk about how the efficient use of data means that you can get by with fewer bodies.
Yeah, I think excellent points are brought up. So to address some of those, the fact that data itself, and I think David is right, we've done a lot in Western Canada here, not just from the fact that our regulatory environment has always been pretty stringent in terms of reporting requirements for companies. So the data sets have been pretty comprehensive. The integrity of those and the accuracy, I think, have initially when I started in the business 40 years ago, I would say that certainly there was some holes in the data, but I think that companies like Geologic and others who have built a business around data also helps to create better integrity around it, and that right through back to the regulators, then it forces the companies to be more disciplined and putting in good and accurate numbers and checking that before they go in, right? So I think that's important, and we've come a long ways in Western Canada and I'll call it right from the rig floor, the geological data, rig floor information, to completions data is pretty darn good these days. What we need to continue to work with, as David brought up, is the let's call it the environmental front. The data that's residing in the ESG world is not so solid. I think Alberta continues to lead the way there in terms of capturing some of that, but it is inconsistent, as we know, across Canada and globally. So when we're trying to really dig into that and compare, then it becomes problematic. And and how we integrate that into making decisions and the ability to have that more broad base, I think that's absolutely critical, in that we do reach more larger cloud type data sets that have individuals or people that can check the integrity of that. We can do that a lot through developments with AI these days, right? So I think that's important. And Kevin brought up a great point. With four of us who've been in this business a long time, we sit around our management tables in our boardrooms, and I think you go back and it's always been, well, I think some of these people in the management or boards know better, and you might trust your intuitive aspects of what we used to know. But I think more and more what Kevin's doing with Avatar and some of the initiatives are fantastic, is that some of the younger people who are coming onto the stage are very, very intelligent in this world, right? In terms of data, not just that, but I think they've got a lot of business smarts. We need to make sure that we're bringing those individuals up and opening the doors in management and leadership positions, whether it's data companies to producers to service companies. You know, some of those individuals, we need to open the doors and have that upskilling be represented, no longer sit and say, yeah, I just listened to, you know, a half-hour dissertation by somebody on data, but I don't believe it. You need to start changing that mindset and saying, ooh, there's some patterns here that are telling you something. Don't just go back to the old biases of what, you know, we may have done in the past, because I don't know if that is longer a good way to do business. So it's just some general comments there. And if I've missed anything, go ahead, Bill.
No, that's wonderful. It allows me to move very nicely to Kevin, because there's a great question from the audience. The individual points out that in the 80s, there was a sort of a brain drain from Canada that we were able to understand, where working in other jurisdictions was more attractive to young talent. And this question really says, are we noticing difficulty recruiting young talent into the industry? So Kevin, I'll get you to reflect on that within the Avatar context, but also pose you this question: is digital enablement and the fact that young generation, the next generation of engineering, geoscience, business talent coming in, we are a very sophisticated industry technologically, but if you're on the outside looking in, we still look like a legacy sector. And so if you could sort of riff on those things and where data plays as a next generation recruiting tool.
Yeah, I think that there clearly is a differential between, you know, the actual culture and the innovation inside the industry, as well as the huge opportunity our industry has. You know, and it's not just that, you know, commodity prices are great right now, and the future of the industry is looking a lot more comfortable than 12 months ago. But it's also the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities in our industry are things like CCS, like hydrogen, like geothermal, that we can't electrify everything. Like any credible pathway to net zero oil and gas plays a massive sector. And so there is this disconnect between, you know, I'd say public perception and where the industry is actually going. And you know, this question is spot on. It's a major challenge. King's College in London, you know, long one of the premier engineering feeder systems for the European super majors, has stopped offering petroleum engineering. You know, about a month ago, I met with a student energy group at the University of Calgary with Peter Chertakian, and Peter asked the roundtable, how many of you, if you could get a job next year, would for $60,000 a year at Microsoft, or if you could get a job for $120,000 a year next year at a large oil and gas company? And 100% of them said they'd take the job at Microsoft. And so what we're really trying to do at Avatar is really, you know, change that narrative of, you know, when you come work in oil and gas, you got to work on the biggest opportunity of the future. And, you know, in that way, I think energy is the new internet. Like, we are literally talking about repowering the world. The amount of capital, innovation, technology that this is going to require is astounding. And it's incredible to see, you know, the oil and gas companies just come to the table in incredible ways. The pathways to net zero, the really cool stuff Andy's doing on carbon capture. You know, there's some big meaty projects here. And I think that when you reframe it in that way, it's pretty incredible the uptake we've gotten. You know, for the last Avatar program, we had 250 spots and we received well over 600 applications. And so the demands for young professionals to work in creative ways and be empowered is a slightly different value prop than maybe we've done before, but I think we're starting to get it right. And then I would say, you know, from a data perspective, like tomorrow morning in Avatar, we're doing, Microsoft's hosting a hackathon. I have absolutely no idea what these digital tools that the carbon projects and the accelerator are going to be using. But I promise in 15 minutes, the kids will have it figured out. So again, it's really around creating that sense of kind of digital enablement and changing the value proposition around what the future of the industry looks like. Because they're not looking 5 years out, they're looking 30 years out. And if you frame it like, well, we can't electrify everything, so the only rational solutions to net zero exist inside oil and gas, the future 30 years out looks a lot brighter.
Well, thank you for that. You know, and you raise a whole bunch of really important points, and a segue to David here with this dynamic. You know, is there an opportunity for our industry to prevent present a more unified narrative, David, in terms of if we get the data integrity dynamic and we're communicating with external stakeholders, because, you know, in the last 10 years, for example, sometimes our own data is used against us. It's that old thing that data will dance to the loudest music it hears. And so our data is sometimes ruptured from the context in which it was originally chosen and used by opponents of the sector to be able to tell a different story that's not based in any kind of data integrity. So maybe, David, if you could sort of reflect on how the quality of data and sort of the irrefutable integrity of it becomes part of a better storytelling. And it's doing double duty. It's helping companies become more effective and efficient and drive to better decisions, but then it has this second opportunity to build a stronger narrative.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Bill. And, you know, the industry has often been a bit defensive, and sometimes with good reason, because there's a very low understanding of energy literacy. Let me put it in the general population. Everybody just assumes that they just plug a cable into a wall and the electricity comes out. We'll just make electricity will do everything, and that'll solve all our problems. And as Kevin pointed out, the oil and gas industry has got a huge future going forward, and we need to make sure that we can send that message. And one of the reasons we can do that credibly is using solid data. And, you know, groups like CAP and others are often running into problems because people say, well, that's just the oil and gas business. And so they would say that, wouldn't they? But if we have really solid data, we can demonstrate the reality of what we're doing and how we're actually improving. And, you know, I talk to operators every day, and there's a tremendous success story, driving down emissions, driving down methane, and people aren't waiting to be told to do it, they're just doing it. But it's all fragmented. We're not actually getting that message out. We need to do a better job of that. And so, but to contrast that with what we have here, particularly in Alberta, but in Western Canada generally, when you see people from other jurisdictions coming in, they're astonished by the quality and the scale of data that we've got. So we can do it here. We just need to do it across the broader spectrum. And I want to pick up on what Kevin talked about there, because I thought it was a very important concept about digital enablement. And that's key. And we talk about it in terms of democratization of data, but it's the same concept where you take the data set, and for operators and service companies going forward, you've got to have more people in your companies have access to data so that they can make data-driven decisions. The industry makes a lot of data-driven decisions, but they're often made by a small group. And the further you get out from that small group, it's like, well, yeah, we'll kind of do it this way. And so you've got to democratize the data or digitally enable the data to have more users out there making decisions, and also on the same set of data, because that standardization is critical. Because if you get multiple sources of data, you get confusion. You get a single source, you get knowledge. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to improve data, to feed it more into our decisions, and to take advantage of this tremendous opportunity for our business. Because, 2030 or 2050, it's net zero. It's not actually zero. And we'll be a big part of it.
That's a great set of perspectives. And I would use that to jump into this, and Andy raised it earlier, and you just spoke of emissions, and the dominance that emissions dynamics play in the public's mind, and the political mind, and the regulatory mind, the investor mind. But I want to park emissions for a moment and ask you, Andy, to reflect on, it's the old orange is the new black, water is the new emissions. And what do you think about, we're doing phenomenal things in water stewardship, and we're gathering lots of data and that sort of thing. How do you think we prepare for a future where water usage and stewardship is riding right alongside emissions in terms of the opportunities? And we've got some great water stories to tell in this sector and some great data underpinning it. And this is about sort of how do we use that to build that more effective ESG stewardship data-driven model around water?
Yeah, I think that's a excellent point too, Bill, that, you know, there's been a lot of work done in our sector on water recycle and reuse, you know, so, but I think that what happens is that, you know, that reporting is just still in its infancy. You know, we're capturing some of it, but some of the producers, even right from the point of, you know, where we're, let's say gathering, you know, water for and reusing it for whether drilling operations or completions, you know, that the more of that that can be kind of integrated and demonstrated, the better. And I think a lot of that is kind of hidden within, let's say in Alberta, the records of the Alberta regulator, right? It's not visible enough. And I think that the opportunities for data firms to be able to help extract that and to display it, in addition to the companies, is going to be very powerful, right? And again, here's an opportunity, I think, for data companies to go to regulators and say, hey, this is a really important part of, you know, where we need to show in terms of not just the regulatory compliance, but to show to the public that Canada is a leader here. And let's, you know, that is an important function of showing where the water usage and how companies have been able to move there. Because what we see is that, you know, certain companies out there will talk about their own, right? And once in a while, you'll hear CAP pull together some numbers, and as well as the AER comment. But a lot of times it's individual companies that will talk about what they've done. And I think we need, just like with integrating data, we need a more collective comment, right? And illustration of that data set, so that it's not just company specific, it's industry specific. And then I think more importantly, how do you take that, and I'm a big pusher on this, is that how do you take that and use some of those techniques and technologies to others, to help other sectors? Because one of the things that people, I think about, you know, in the oil and gas sector, is that we're too insular, right? I mean, and that's how the sector has in the past functioned that way. But, you know, Bill and I have had a lot of conversations about this, but things that we do here can be extended to other sectors, and we need to be really finding the platforms to do that. Data is one aspect, but, you know, business ideas, you know, what Kevin's doing again is expanding that, broadening, you know, the thought processes beyond our sector. But we need to be sponsoring that and making sure that's out there, right? So that's a big factor. And I, you know, go back to the comment Kevin made, that, you know, with Peter Terzakian's, you know, ask or comment that, you know, would you work for a software company or oil and gas? Well, I think without us doing some of that, you're not gonna capture some of those bright minds that think, you know, why would I go to oil and gas? Is it the future that's not there, or I just don't want to be associated with fossil fuels? Well, we're providing energy. You know, and the energy is not going away. We're going to have to supply that to the computing firms and others, in addition to other renewables and green power. But we can do it better, and we need the bright minds to help us in addition. So, you know, there's a lot in this industry. And we've been talking about, don't think about this as an oil and gas sector. It's an energy sector that we believe is going to help power, you know, all kinds of things that we want to do in the future and do it better for a greener planet, right? That's how we have to think.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think a lot, and I reflect a lot on the role that data will play in shifting that narrative. And this is a great segue to our next question from Mario Kaya. But, you know, before I get there, I look at how narratives work. And, you know, in many ways, I say to people, look, at Tesla is just a mining company that produces electric vehicles, if you want to flip it on itself, in a way of, you know, we are a technology sector that just happens to produce energy in many ways, and we're driven by data in that. So that's an important narrative. And this is a great question for Mario. And it goes to your point about digital enablement and data. Kevin, how can we use that to ride alongside and influence this push for STEM education, right? And you know, and that's a really terrific question for Mario, because there is an opportunity to infuse those two things together, right? In terms of, and Avatar is doing a lot of that, but specifically towards the STEM initiatives.
Yeah, like I think it's connecting the big bold projects, the big exciting projects that we're working on in oil and gas through the STEM lens, which are, very technology, engineering, math, science focused. And, that there's the sort of imagination captivation of education right now, in the sense that, the one thing Tesla did fantastically, even though they didn't make money for a decade, was capture people's imagination. And I don't think we can I don't think we have to be really cognizant of the power of what people's imaginations and how they're captivated to a storyline to drive where they go in their education process. And so I think that, capturing people's attention through, the big bold projects we're working on, like the carbon capture and the hydrogen projects, is a real way of captivating people's imaginations. I would add one small letter to the STEM, though, is I would say arts. We need to be able to tell our story. And so I think that it's STEAM as much as it is STEM. But there is this changing face of, I think, education, where because the pace of technology is increasing so rapidly, one now has to really look at their interface with education and training as a lifelong journey to kind of stay current. Because in the digital world, 2 years and you're out of date. And so how do you keep pace in that? And we need to be looking at integrating STEM education into day-to-day operations in the industry to make sure we're as up to speed as possible.
So just before I shift to David and build off that point, a shameless plug for two organizations that are working hard to change the narrative. So Alberta Water Smart has a pilot project initiative that they're just launching to produce a context-based water ESG scorecard that's a made in Canada proof point in terms of, and part of the pilot project is figuring out how to link a company's water performance processes with context-based measurement, so you can understand the way the company is playing in the watershed itself and that sort of thing. So watch for Alberta Water Smart doing that. And to build off Kevin's point, the Canadian Society for Unconventional Resources, I'm proud to be a director on that. We're, through our outreach programs now, getting into all the post-secondaries across Canada with the unconventional resource narrative. And what we're finding is that the students' response is, well, how come nobody told us this before, right? And so when Dr. Brad Hayes is articulating the way data is used to drive environmental performance decisions making, he's always astounded that even within our own backyard, even at the graduate student level, is that there's a disconnect that's been allowed to develop over time. On that. So, but coming back, David, you've been serving the operating community for years. Maybe if you could reflect on some of the evolutions you've seen in terms of all companies, because they have a new technology, taking two what people thought might have been disparate data sets between G&G and DNC, for example, and sort of all when they can put them side by side, and they realize, holy smokes, there's a relationship there that drives us to a decision. What have you seen since 1983 when Geologic started?
Yeah. Well, that's a long time ago, Bill.
I have to the analog era that Kevin was talking about. So
yeah, after we moved off steam power, well, there has been a huge change. When the way data has gone, and since I joined Geologic in 1997, from people would tend to have data in separate areas, and there was a very low understanding of the value of data. And it tended, this went right through from the regulators through the industry to, the users, where people just assumed that data was there and it was okay. And we saw this in, people would talk about the great crew change, and we could see this through both in regulators and operators, where there was a guy down the corridor, and it always was a guy. It was an old white guy that nobody knew really what he did, but data just kind of appeared. And then he retired, and suddenly everybody couldn't access the data, or it wasn't consistent. And so there's now been a much deeper understanding of the fact that if you don't have the right input on the data, you're going to get garbage coming out the other side, the old garbage in, garbage out stuff. And in our industry, it all starts with the operators providing the information to the regulator that then provides the information to companies like ours that can high grade the data and cross integrate it. And there's more of an understanding now of what you need to be able to do. And you can't just forget about the data management at the back end, because that's a huge area, and it's boring and people don't get excited about it, so they don't think about it, but it's actually critical to everything we do going forward. And that the availability now of these tools that allow you to interrogate the data at a deeper level means people have a better understanding of that quality and integration plans.
In terms of just a follow-up question, David, is what do you think is the opportunity for companies, individual companies, to tell a better individual corporate narrative by giving exemplars of where data-driven decision-making has resulted in, whether it's an emissions goal that they've reached or some other very laudable achievement that's been driven by good data decision-making?
Well, one of the first things they need to do is to make sure that they're talking in a standard context. Because if you have, and we had the ex-governor of the Bank of England, who's just joined, I think it was BlackRock, I forget his name at this point, but he was talking about all the things that his company had been doing because they were avoiding emissions. And he got into a lot of trouble for that because he wasn't applying a standard methodology and a standard framework. And so we've got to be careful if we're throwing around numbers like, we've reduced emissions by X or methane by Y. How are we measuring it? And is it standard? Because otherwise, nobody is going to believe what's happening. And there's a lot of challenges for operators right now because there aren't many ESG standards, or rather, I should rephrase that, there's too many. So you've got to be clear and transparent. What are we doing? How did we arrive at it? And this is something that you can follow and you can trust. And sadly, I think the broader public right now doesn't trust what they hear, partly because they don't understand it. And to get that trust, we have to be transparent and communicate better about what we're doing. And it all starts with the standards.
Perfect. So, Kevin, did you have a response to that?
I was going to build on that because it's actually something our industry probably does the absolute best. Just this morning we announced Shaw and Rogers as a partner for Avatar going forward, and it was the first time Shaw had made commentary on net zero. And I was looking through TELUS's statement last week where they announced that they were going to be operationally net neutral by 2030. And then I dug into it, and they weren't even talking about scope 1 emissions. They just invented this other term that nobody who's on the front lines of this knows. And TELUS had so much more credibility on it. But when you actually dig into it, this is, I think, an area our industry can really get a leading role on, because realistically we are far ahead than almost every sector on this stuff. So I think there is an opportunity to get there. But it was funny to me how much more credibility had on this the TELUS had on this than Suncor, even though Suncor's was way better.
Absolutely. So that's a great segue to a question for Andy, building on a combined sort of statement plus question. And this is, I promised you, Andy, I would sort of get you to root something in a global context. Advantage was is involved in the Rockies LNG initiative, which is a global opportunity for our natural gas industry. But this, one of the delegates sort of poses the question: is there not a degree of arrogance in us thinking we can be world-class in alternative energies when our experience is infantile compared to other jurisdictions? And how do we actually establish competitive advantage when we can be notionally far behind? The questioner says, and so maybe you can reflect on the fact that your evolving landscape conversation this morning really is also about energy transition, energy systems transition, of which Peter Tertzakian speaks very eloquently about, and which Avatar addresses. And is there an opportunity to sort of think about what we've done so well in oil and gas data and decision making, and start, to your point earlier in the conversation, sort of thinking that through and applying those sets of standards and that experience to other energy system component parts of which oil and gas will be intermeshing and synchronizing with over the decades to come? There's a lot to share, but yeah.
No, it's a good point, Bill. And I think right off the go, when you're as you posed that question, one of the things that caught my ear was that when you said, how can Canada be competitive here where other jurisdictions are maybe way ahead in some of these other energy sources? Well, let's get down to firstly, the fact that, and I think it's missed that Canada is one of the lowest emitting countries in the world, right? Like we, in terms of how much percentage of emissions we actually put out there, it's we're virtually on the very low end of the scale. So we start at a very good point already on a global perspective. And when you think about the opportunity like Rockies to supply energy outside, we should not forget that one of the things that we're doing and already ahead, as I said, is the producers in this country, especially natural gas producers or natural gas liquids, are so far down on emissions or low on emissions already that if many of us can get to net zero, then we supply let's call it an almost or net zero stream of supply to, let's say, an LNG facility that then is designed just like the Shell project to be net zero, going forward. So we do provide one of the cleanest sources of energy out there. And in that tooling, some of the discussions are already there that whether it's LNG or other parts, is that how do we then, is there a line of sight to be able to integrate some of the equipment pieces we have to look at hydrogen, look at other aspects, because all of that we talk about in supplying energy to the world, and outside of, and even hydro and nuclear is a little different, but a lot of it generated is really technologies that we've done, right? It's a lot of it is processing, gas processing, or manufacturing related type of processing that we employ. And we have the people and the skills to do it, right? Like that is why Canada has, I think, always been seen as a leader in, and I know Kevin knows that inside out, and you've seen it, Bill, that in the oil and gas world, Canada's always been a leader in innovating and bringing products and new ideas to the table. And that is no different when we look at ability to transition to different energy sources. Canada will and is today already a leader, but we can be much more. And I think that we should not think that other jurisdictions are that far ahead of us. So the difference, though, and I'll make that point, is we need to physically reduce emissions, not carbon offset the emissions, right? And that is a big thing that people don't understand, is companies like, and I have nothing against, whether it's Amazon or others, but they cannot physically reduce their emissions unless we do it as an energy source, right? Or provide the energy source to reduce it. They can provide all kinds and buy carbon offsets to say that we've given you a green package or we're going to sell you. And I laugh a little bit at some of the things that, you read about some of the major oil and gas companies who just sold a cargo of call it emission-free oil. Well, those are offsets. Are they really, and they need to get the emissions physically down. That's what we're doing, right? Like that's what we have to do. It's not offsets, right? We need to do it. And that's what Canada can lead. Yeah.
So we've only got a few minutes left, and these have been wonderful set of perspectives, but I do have a question for Kevin with his former Beaver drilling hat on, and maybe I'll get you, David. I'll ask Kevin, and you can riff off Kevin's response, and then we'll wrap things up. But the questioner, one of the delegates asked the question is, do we need data and innovation in traditional oil field services these days? And so if emissions is a thing that you just talked about, Anthony, is, what else can we do to build bridges between oilfield services companies and operating companies that are looking at the same sets of data and improving performance because they have a common view of the data that should drive good decision making? And so, Kevin, that was something you were active in Beaver in terms of, using data to work more effectively with your clients.
Yeah, and I would say now more than ever. Certainly the last year and a half has been just, brutal for the oil field services in a way that it wasn't for the upstream. But, the oil field services have always brought innovation to the table in the industry in new and profound ways. And, as Andy was mentioning, we're talking about absolute emissions reductions. The easiest low-lying fruit on absolute emissions reductions is operational efficiencies. And that is around your drilling optimization, your frac optimization, all of those things. The less drilling, the less emissions. The less days on a frac pad, the less emissions. There's a low-lying fruit OFS can kind of bring to the table. And from the conversations we're having with many of our upstream partners in upstream, is they're going to start tracking their supply chain on emissions targets. And so I think there's a big competitive advantage there for OFS players to play in the data game of driving efficiency reductions.
Absolutely. And just as we shift to David for the closing comments and wrap up, we're actively out demonstrating and doing discoveries with oilfield services clients with our new GDC cloud technology, which is the SSIO acquisition that we made in late 2020. And one of the themes that consistently comes up is operators are asking the oilfield services companies, talk to us about your ESG strategies, right? And so that's the point that you're marrying there with that data can be the relationship bridge to build that operational efficiency. So David, reflecting on that point in terms of sometimes it's the independence of third-party data, curated data, and convening of the data that makes all the difference in the world too. So open-ended question for you.
You bet, absolutely, Bill. Thank you. And building on what Andy and Kevin just said there, I think when Andy says that the people who could really make the emissions change is the oil and gas companies, he's absolutely right. They're talking about real reductions in emissions, and yet they cannot achieve that unless they also integrate what their service companies are doing. And it'll fail otherwise. And so there needs to be a way to have a standard measurement of those issues between the oilfield service companies and the operators, and a real sharing of data so that the oilfield service companies can help the operators do what we really need to do. And to Kevin's point about the operational effectiveness, I mean, that's key. So I know we're running out of time now, but thank you, Bill, for doing this, and to everybody else for participating.
Well, thank you.
To end on.
So thank you, David. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Andy. I know you've all got incredibly busy schedules. Andy, you're back to the CIBC conference, and Avatar is doing phenomenally exciting things these days. And I would encourage everybody to sort of watch Avatar, watch the various pillars of the whole Avatar innovations infrastructure. Again, also all changing the narrative. So just as we wrap up here, just a reminder that you'll see the link here to getting a PDF version of the very substantial white paper from which some of the data that I talked about earlier is drawn. But right after this, you'll receive the slide deck, and you'll receive the link to the PDF version of the research. And I would encourage you to share it and open up these conversations, because we do think that to the degree that there is a sort of growing literacy among the average member of the general public around data can be the platform on which we tell our next generation story. So with that, I thank you everybody for the gift of your time on this, and look forward to future conversations. Thanks.